Today we will talk about the new chronology. I will give a lecture under the provisional title, Introduction to the New Chronology. Many have heard of the new chronology, but far from everyone knows what this subject, what this science is about. Therefore, I think such a brief lecture will be useful to many. I'll start with the fact that on the internet there is an official website of the new chronology called the Scientific Direction New Chronology. It contains a lot of information. History of the new chronology, information about the authors, books on the new chronology, a global chronological map, about which I will briefly speak later, articles by our readers and listeners, interviews, responses to criticism, literature, a collection of articles, a movie theater, many video materials, films that we produced, films in which we gave interviews. We highly recommend visiting this movie theater. Antique books and images. Wiki chronology. This is some kind of brief encyclopedia, guide to the new chronology. After all, it is now quite a branched scientific direction, so such a reference is needed. Handbook, other authors, polemics, links. This is information about our website. About the authors, Anatoly Fomenko, the author of the new chronology. Gleb Nosovsky. We are employees of the Mechanics and Mathematics faculty of Moscow State University. Vladimir Kalashnikov, a well-known specialist in statistics and computer methods of data processing. Tatiana Fomenko, professor of the Faculty of Computational Mathematics and Cybernetics. These are the authors of the new chronology. Some books on the new chronology. Here is the 7-volume edition, which outlines the basics of the new chronology, criticism of traditional methods, our methods and applications. 7 volumes are divided into several books. English translations of the Septology, 4 volumes are presented here. Films on the new chronology, shot by a well-known film studio. There are currently 24 films available on the internet, but they are not on our website. Following the publication of 7 volumes and films, several books have been released, which talk about materials that were not included in the 7 volumes. These books occupy the second shelf. These are not all the books, just some of them. We will briefly discuss them below. Now I want to list the titles of books in the Septology, so that it is more or less clear what these books are about. Mathematics Reveals Lies is a mathematical investigation of the past. Later on, I will decipher what this means. A criticism of the Scaligerian chronology, chronological shifts, and the compression of history. New chronology. The next book. Antiquity is the Middle Ages. Mirages in history. The Trojan War took place in the 13th century of the Common Era. Gospel events of the 12th century AD and their reflection in the history of the 11th century. Changing dates changes everything. New chronology of Greece and the Bible. Mathematics reveals the deception of medieval chronologists. Next, Stellar Witnesses. 3 authors, Kalashnikov, Nosovsky, Fomenko. Dating the Almagest Star Catalogue. A famous work that contains a catalogue. I will tell you more about this later. A very important book for reconstructing the correct chronology of the past. This whole series is called History, Fiction or Science. The 7 volumes are published under this motto. The next book, which also has a direct relation to astronomy. 3 authors, Nosovsky, Fomenko, and Tatiana Fomenko. Celestial Calendar of the Ancients. Egyptian Zodiacs. History of the Middle Ages on the Star Chart. Chinese Astronomy. Nosovsky, Fomenko, New Chronology of Russia. Russian Chronicles. Mongol-Tatar Conquest. Kulikovo Battle, Ivan the Terrible, Razin, Pugachev. The defeat of Tobolsk and the division of its vast North American possessions between the Romanov Russia and European colonies in America. The birth of the United States of America. The next book of the Septology, The Mystery of Russian History. Authors, Nesovsky, Fomenko. New Chronology of Russia. Tatar and Arabic languages in Russia. Yaroslavl as Novgorod the Great. Ancient English history is a reflection of Byzantine and Horde. The next book, The Empire. Slavic conquest of the world. Europe, China, Japan. Russia as the medieval metropolis of the Great Empire. Rise of the Kingdom. Empire. Where Marco Polo actually traveled. Who are the Etruscans? Ancient Egypt? Scandinavia. Russia Horde on ancient maps. Biblical Russia. This is the 6th volume. The Great Empire of the 14th–17th centuries on the pages of the Bible. Russia Horde and Ottoman Empire are two wings of a single empire. The biblical exodus of Moses is the Ottoman conquest. Biblical Esther and Judith in the 16th century AD. Exploration of America by Russia Horde. Biblical Russia. The birth of American civilization. Biblical Noah and medieval Columbus. The rebellion of the Reformation. Old Testament Jerusalem is Moscow of the 16th century. The Temple of Solomon is the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. The Seven Wonders of the World. Biblical Russia. Calendar and Easter. Nativity of Christ and the Council of Nicaea. The Prophecy of Daniel. Underground Moscow of the 16th century is prototype of the famous ancient labyrinth. Western European myth. Ancient Rome and the Habsburgs. The legacy of the Great Empire in the culture of Eurasia and America. Russian roots of ancient Latin. Languages and writing of the Great Empire. Here are 3 authors: Nesovsky, Fomenko, and Tatiana Fomenko. This is the last volume of the 7 volumes edition. In short, I described the core of the books that outline the essence of the new chronology. Criticism. We'll talk about that a bit later. Our methods and the significance. And now let's start from the beginning. How we know what happened in ancient times and when. This is a portrait of the famous chronologist Joseph Justus Scaliger, 16th century. He is a very famous person. He was the first to create a global chronology, which later became the foundation of modern history textbooks. And what we study today in school and university is essentially the history of Scaliger and Petavius, about whom I will tell you a little later. The origin of this version is the 16th and 17th centuries. Another ancient portrait of Scaliger. This is the famous place in Verona, central Italy. These are the tombs of the Scaliger family. It was a very famous family. They controlled many aspects of medieval Italy. The Scaligers were in power. They controlled many branches of medieval trade, military affairs, and pursued science. And one of this family, Joseph Justus Scaliger, turned out to be the author of the chronology. The thing is, before him, there was some chaos in the documents. Different documents dated events according to different eras. It was difficult to understand which chronicler was counting by which era. It is believed that Scaliger was the first to bring order, to arrange events along a single timeline, and that's how what we know as world history of Eurasia, Africa, and later America emerged. This is one of Scaliger's works. He wrote in Latin. Here, the word temporum means time. In this volume, his version of chronology is presented. Events are distributed along the timeline, with years assigned to them from the creation of the world, and then from the birth of Christ. This is another famous chronologist, Petavius. He continued Scaliger's work in the 17th century and largely completed these studies. Dionysius Petavius created the final version of Scaliger's history textbook, which forms the basis of our modern textbook on ancient and medieval history. This is one of his main works. Also, time in Latin, temporum. It's about the calculation of time, in which years certain events occurred. These are the 3 volumes of Petavius, from the 17th century edition. Very thick volumes in Latin, with close print. Here, it is explained how he and Scaliger dated ancient and medieval events, including a huge number of tables. Here, considerations from astronomy were first applied, dating eclipses described in ancient texts, various calendars, conversions from one calendar to another. All of this is contained in these 3 thick volumes. Unfortunately, historians today do not engage in chronology. This is, unfortunately, because the subject, as it turns out, is not simple. More on that later. All these volumes are now in archives, and modern historians do not study or process them. They naturally refer to later tables, where dates are already assigned, even without references to the original source, to the works of Scaliger and Petavius. Here is a spread from his volume, Dionysius Petavius, Doctrina Temporum, that is, the doctrine of time. This is a more recent example. After these studies, depicting events that occurred in antiquity became a very trendy activity for chronologists and historians. Here is shown the timeline, different kingdoms, different rulers. Events are distributed along the timeline. It was a very trendy pursuit. Huge maps, huge atlases were created, where chronologists and historians, already following the historical version of Scaliger and Petavius, distributed events in such a visual form. There was a lot of information, impossible to hold it in head, so these atlases, as was thought at that time, were very useful and necessary. Now let's see what, actually, Scaliger and Petavius did, what all this soon led to. Here is a fragment of a well-known study. You can find all links on the provided website. All the references are given in the books. Due to the controversy and the dubiety of all these medieval computations, the Genesis dating, for instance, varies greatly from document to document. Let us quote the main examples taken from various primary sources. Here's something interesting, take a look, 5969 BC. This is the Antiochian dating according to Theophilus. Another version, a bit lower, but we won't discuss that now. The second version, the date of creation of the world, 5508 BC, the Byzantine dating, also known as the Constantinople version. The next Genesis version is 5493 BC. This is the Alexandrian era or the era of Annianus. The question is not philosophical, it's about how dates of events in documents are then registered from these base points. For example, it might be said, such and such year from the creation of the world. One needs to know exactly which creation the chronicler was counting from. As you can see, the dates vary. Let's move on, there are many of them. 4004 BC, according to Usher, a Hebraic dating. 5872 BC, dating of the 70 translators. 4700 BC, Sumerian. 3761 BC, Judaic. 3491, the creation of the world according to Hieronymus, 5199 BC, dating according to Eusebius of Caesarea, 5500 according to Hippolytus and Sextus Julius Africanus, 5515 BC, according to Theophilus, 5551 according to Augustine. The amplitude of fluctuations from this considered fundamental reference point for ancient chronology dates, as you can see, is about 2,100 years. This is a lot. I repeat, the dates of documents are counted from these dates. It is necessary to know from which specific date the chronicler is counting. With a fluctuation of 2,000 years, a multitude of problems arise. It is necessary to clarify what exactly the chronicler meant. Here we have presented only a few of the most well-known examples. However, it is useful to know that there are about 200 different versions of the creation of the world. Furthermore, another interesting detail. Irish Archbishop James Ussher, who had obviously nurtured a fondness for precise numbers, had made the assumption that the world was created in the early morning hours on October 23, 4004 BC. As we understand today, with any sensible approach, this is, of course, a kind of Kabbalah, purely numerical activity, unrelated to real events. Nevertheless, this has been accepted by the Scaliger-Petavius version, the morning hours of October 23, 4000 years BC. What did all this lead to? It led to the fact that long before our work, before the new chronology, various scientists noticed serious problems with dating. By no means we were the first. Here is the renowned work of John Hardwin, a famous scholar, Jesuit, France, 18th century. He is known from various sources. He was a librarian. He was a distinguished scholar. He held prominent positions in the church. He wrote a work in which he stated that the Scaliger-Petavius version is erroneous, and we are not talking about errors of 1 or 2, plus or minus 3 or 5 years, but errors of decades and even centuries. He was one of the first critics of the Scaliger-Petavius chronology. Another critic, Edwin Johnson, this is England, 19th century. He himself engaged in chronology, published the works of John Hardwin with comments, and also stated that in the Scaligerian chronology and in his textbook, which by that time had already become sort of solidified and was accepted as the cornerstone of historical science, there were very serious errors. Another critic, Robert Baldauf. This is Germany, 19th century. His book, History and Criticism, is well known. Completely independently of Jean Hardwin and Edwin Johnson, without even citing them, he may not even have known about their work. He stated that there were very significant errors in the Scaligerian chronology, and insisted that many events of the Middle Ages were artificially pushed back into the past and declared ancient, and that a revision of the dating was necessary. This is a summary of Robert Baldauf's book. Another work by Edwin Johnson on the same topic. Next, the famous name, Isaac Newton. We know him in mathematics and physics as a great scientist, the creator of the foundations of mathematical analysis. He discovered many laws of physics and astronomy, held prominent positions, had a huge influence in both science and natural philosophy of his time. Besides mathematics and physics, he also delved into chronology. He was interested in how dates were calculated during the time of Scaliger. After all, much time had passed since Scaliger's era to Newton's time. Isaac Newton published a book entitled, The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. It is a brief chronicle, from the earliest known artifacts in Europe to the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. Newton worked on this book for about 40 years and was afraid to publish it. The book was published literally in the last months of his life, against the author's will. When it was published, it caused a great scandal. What did Sir Isaac suggest exactly? Basically, he had analyzed the chronology of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece before the beginning of the Common Era. He must have lacked the time for the analysis of more recent epochs. His tractate only got published in the last year of his life. For instance, the contemporary consensual version of chronology ascribes the first years of reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Menes to approximately 3000 BC. Newton suggested that this event could be given a date as recent as 946 BC. Thus, the shift forward in time comprises about 2000 years. Nowadays the myth of Theseus, and this is a very famous ancient myth, is dated to the 15th century BC. However, Sir Isaac claimed that these events took place around 936 BC. Hence, the shift of dates forward that he suggests amounts to roughly 700 years. The famous Trojan War is dated to roughly 1225 BC today, but Newton claims this event to have occurred in 904 BC. The shift forward here is approximately 330 years, etc. I won't list all these shifts. This book has been published. We found it in the archives. It was not published for a long time. And thanks to us, it was translated and published in Russian. If desired, it can be found both in stores and online. Newton's main conclusions may be encapsulated as follows. He moves a part of the history of ancient Greece about 300 years forward in time, closer to us. The history of ancient Egypt, covering a span of several thousand years according to Scaliger, that is, 3000 BC and on, is moved forward in time by Newton and compressed into a time period as short as 330 years, namely, 946 BC to 617 BC. Newton also moves some fundamental dates of the ancient Egyptian history about 1800 years forward in time. Sir Isaac Newton only managed to revise the dates preceding 200 BC. His observations were of a rather eclectic nature, and he could not find any system in these apparently chaotic redatings. What happened next? It's instructive, especially for the younger generation. Here is a great scientist, whom we respect for his discoveries in mathematics, physics, astronomy, and optics. How did part of the scientific community react to his book? Cesare Lombroso tries to bring the issue to conclusion in his notorious Genius and Insanity in the following manner. Quote from Cesare Lombroso, "Newton, of whom much was written, who conquered the human mind, went senile in his old age, although of a much milder degree than the previous ones." That must have been the time when he had written those works on chronology, the Apocalypse, and the letters to Bentley, so different in merit and seriousness from those of his youth. End of the quote by Cesare Lombroso. Our commentary. Similar accusations would later be addressed at Nikolai Morozov, another scientist bold enough to revise chronology. Nikolai Morozov, a famous Russian scientist and encyclopedist of the 19th and first half of the 20th century. He was very active in public life and was a member of the radical political organization,
people's will, for which he suffered.
He was imprisoned and spent several decades there. In prison, he began researching the Bible. He read a lot of books on chronology, history, and also chemistry. He has a famous work on chemistry that attracted great interest from Mendeleev, was published and has since been considered one of the classic works in the field.
When he was released from prison, he compiled all his research on chronology into a major work titled Christ.
He managed to found an institute where some of his colleagues, astronomers, historians, philologists, and philosophers gathered. Together, they created a work, which I will briefly talk about.
This is Nikolai Morozov in his advanced age.
He was an honorary academician of the USSR Academy of Sciences, highly recognized in scientific circles.
This is a monument to him in the village of Borek, where his estate still stands in the Yaroslavl region to this day, where he lived until the last years of his life.
Today there is the Morozov Museum, which has been preserved more or less in the same state as during the last years of Nikolai Morozov's life.
This is his father, Shepochkin.
This is his mother.
This is the first volume of his famous work, Christ, which was published in 1927.
So,
Here is the title page of the first volume of Morozov's work, titled Christ. The septology was published with great difficulty, facing significant resistance from historians who did not approve of Morozov's work and his institute.
The original title of the work was entirely different, not Christ. It was called, The History of Human Culture and Natural Life, which accurately reflects the essence of this research. It was based on the mathematical and astronomical methods of that time.
The title Christ was given at the request of the publishing house, which believed that in the era of atheism, the name Christ would better promote this work.
The resistance of historians was overcome thanks to Morozov's appeal to the highest authorities of Russia at that time,
To Lenin, Lunacharsky, and Dzerzhinsky.
Thanks to their support, this work was published. The first book is titled Celestial Milestones of Human History. It deals with astronomy. What did Morozov do? Here's a brief overview.
Having analyzed a great body of material, Morozov put forth and partially proved the fundamental hypothesis that Scaliger's chronology had been expanded arbitrarily as compared to reality. This hypothesis was based on the repetitions that Morozov had found, namely, the texts that apparently describe the same events, but are dated differently and considered unrelated in our time. The publication of this work caused vivid discussions in the press, and its repercussions can be found in contemporary literature. There had been a number of rational counter-arguments, but the critical part of Christ remained undisputable in its entirety. Apparently, Morozov had been unaware of the similar works of Sir Isaac Newton and Edwin Johnson that were all but forgotten by his time. This makes the fact that many of Morozov's conclusions coincide with those of Newton and Johnson all the more amazing.
We have discussed the problems that arose in Scaliger's chronology with the Genesis date, which is important for chronology. In Egyptian history, there is also a fundamental date from which many events are counted today.
This is the date of the accession to the throne of the first pharaoh Menes. It turns out that different documents provide such different information that, for example, German scholars have determined the time when Menes mounted the throne with the following results. Boak places this event in the year 5702 BC, Unger in 5613 BC. The famous Egyptologist of the 19th century Brugsch in 4455 BC, Laut in 4157 BC, Lepsius in 3892 BC, Bunsen in 3623 BC. This quote is not ours. It's from the famous work of Brugsch, who disputes with these scholars and states, the difference between the extreme dates is enormous. Brugsch continues, amounting to no less than 2097 years. That is, the starting point, the beginning of the Egyptian timeline indeed fluctuates with an amplitude, at least, of about 2,000 years.
The situation hasn't improved to the present day. This is our quote. Modern tables date the beginning of the reign of Menes differently, to approximately 3100 BC or roughly 3000 BC etc. The fluctuation span for this essential date amounts to 2,700 years.
If we consider other opinions, for instance those of the French Egyptologists, link provided, the situation becomes even more complex. Champollion gives the date 5867, Lesueur 5770, Marriott, a very famous Egyptologist, 5004 BC, Chabas 4000 BC, Meyer 3182, Indjayevsky 2850, Wilkinson 2320, Palmer, also a very famous specialist, 2224. The discrepancy between the datings of Champollion and Palmer equals 3,643 years.
No commentary is needed, really. I repeat, this is the fluctuation of the starting point of Egyptian history according to the pharaoh's reigns.
Let's go back a little bit.
We are back in the 16th century.
This is a well-known painting depicting the Council of Trent.
It was convened in the 16th century in Europe for the following purpose.
At this council, two things were discussed, recorded, and accepted for mandatory implementation.
The first was Scaliger's global chronology, and the second was the canon of the Bible and biblical books.
The council lasted not 1 day, not 2 days, not 1 month, not 1 year. It lasted for about 20 years. They convened, adjourned, argued, reconvened, adjourned again until they finally agreed by voting to accept Scaliger's chronology as the basis and the canon of the Bible. Subsequently, based on this council, the famous Index of Forbidden Books was published.
Books were sought out and burned.
In particular, a huge number of texts that spoke about biblical history but contradicted the canon accepted at this council were burned. Most of them were burned, but, fortunately not all. That's how they dealt with competing scientific viewpoints in those years. Another depiction of the council. It was a famous council, very popular. Today there are many engravings, many paintings depicting this event, which is considered a fundamental event for the chronology of the Bible and for the chronology of history.
Let's stop here. We have talked about the origins of the modern chronology of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and Egyptian history that we accept today. Scaliger, Petavius, the Council of Trent. Usually, our contemporaries, mathematicians, physicists, chemists, say, well, let's suppose Newton, Morozov are right. Let's suppose Scaliger's version has some errors. Today, there are various methods: dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating, dating by coins, numismatics, and so on. Today, perhaps, all this has been verified and confirmed.
It turns out that Scaliger was right. Therefore, Newton, Edwin Johnson, Morozov argued with them in vain, and Egyptologists like Brugsch pointing out the discrepancy of 3,000 years in the fluctuation of the starting point of the chronology of Egyptian history was also in vain. Thus, let's take a few minutes and talk about the methods archaeologists and historians use today to date ancient events and try to verify the dates we know from textbooks. I must say right away that there are significant difficulties here. It's not all that simple. These difficulties are little known to the general public but are known to specialists. Now I will give a very brief overview to make it clear what we are talking about.
Dendrochronology. What is dendrochronology? We imagine tree rings.
It is believed that the size of the rings reacts to the local climate. If there are many rains, the ring will be thick. If there are few rains, the ring will be thin. This is a kind of graph of ring thickness distribution, and since a tree lives not for 1 year but for several years, it is possible to construct a certain scale by stitching together these graphs of different trees and obtain a graph showing how one can move back in time based on these rings. Here's an excerpt from our book. The problems and deficiencies of dendrochronology and several other dating methods. An important point, the consequent scale of dendrochronological datings does not extend further back in time than the 10th century AD. The dendrochronological method is one of the main modern dating methods claiming to be capable of dating historical artifacts independently.
Its idea is quite simple. It is based on the assumption that the yearly growth of tree rings is uneven. Annual ring thickness rates are supposed to be roughly similar for the trees of the same kind that grow in similar conditions. However, the European dendrochronological scales only reach several centuries back in time, which does not allow for the dating of ancient constructions. Many European scientists have started to experiment with the dendrochronological method. Quote,
However, obtaining results appeared a very complex task.
the oldest trees in the European forests are only 300 to 400 years old.
Deciduous trees have vaguely defined rings which are hard to study and most reluctant to tell the researcher anything about the past.
Quality archaeological material proved extremely scarce, against all expectations.
This is said by a dendrochronology specialist.
Now, there will be a diagram. I will show it now. Then we'll go back and there will be comments on the diagram.
This diagram illustrates fragments of dendrochronological scales for different kinds of timber: oak, box, cedar, pine, juniper, and conifers in general.
All of these scales have a very obvious gap around 1000 AD.
Thus, none of them can be continued without intervals further back in time than the 10th century AD.
Here is the diagram.
Here are the scales plotted by trees.
This is oak. This is box, cedar, pine, juniper, all coniferous. This is a map of Europe, Turkey, Italy, above, France, Germany.
The scales are shown in black, and the presumed datings are shown in gray.
Here is our era, the year 2000. We move down along the stitched pieces of these scales. And we see that for oak, we reached the 10th century.
Then there is a gap and a presumed dating. Box poses a problem.
It's very indistinct, making it difficult to date.
Someone attempted to date old samples. I'll talk about it a bit later.
Let's take cedar.
Its scale does exist today.
We go on and end around the year 1600 AD. Then there's a gap, followed by presumed datings.
Pine is a good material. We go on and even reach slightly below the 10th century, but then there's another gap. Juniper is also a good material.
We go on and there are two gaps. 10th century, gap, another gap.
Well, and for all conifers in general.
We go on, there's a gap and then a presumed dating. Look, here's a certain boundary, the 10th century. Unfortunately, it's not possible to extend all these scales earlier than the 10th century AD.
Question: where did all this come from?
The answer is simple. The chronology of Scaliger is taken as the basis.
They find, let's say, some trunk or wooden coffin in a pharaoh's tomb.
Chronologists consult a table of modern historians to find out when the pharaoh lived, and they obtain the date of this log.
Then they try to date neighboring wooden samples around this log, from neighboring tombs.
A certain scale is formed.
That is, all of this, everything that came before, unfortunately, is not an independent study but entirely relies on Scaliger's chronology. Therefore, what we more or less reliably know is up to the 10th century, although there are also problems in dendrochronology in our time, but everything before that is Scaliger's chronology.
Let's talk about this. All of the earlier fragments of dendrochronological scales as shown on the diagram cannot be used for independent datings, since their attachment to the time axis is wholly dependent on the Scaligerian chronology, which had served as a basis for the dating of several individual ancient pieces of wood. A piece of wood found in a pharaoh's tomb thus gets the dating of some distant millennium before Christ due to historical considerations based on the Scaligerian chronology. After that, other ancient pieces of wood are linked to the one that has already been dated. These attempts occasionally succeed, which results in the construction of a fragment of the dendrochronological scale around the first piece of wood. Relative datings of ancient findings within this fragment may be correct. However, their absolute dating, that is, the placement of this fragment on the time axis, is wrong. The reason is that the first dating was based on the grossly erroneous Scaligerian chronology, which we will discuss later on. We have talked about dendrochronology.
Another method. There are several of them, but the two most important ones are dendrochronology and the second, as it were, the main one, the radiocarbon method.
Are radiocarbon datings to be trusted?
The radiocarbon datings of ancient, medieval, and modern specimens are scattered chaotically.
Libby's initial idea. The first failure of the author of the method, Libby. He was a physicist, an American. In the 1950s, there arose a quite sound idea to use the decay of radiocarbon for dating samples. A living specimen accumulates radiocarbon during its lifetime.
A tree, organism, tissue, plant. Then it dies. The intake of radiocarbon ceases, and what has accumulated, decays.
It decays exponentially.
As we, mathematicians, understand, we can estimate the time it took for the decay of the initial volume to reach the state that can be measured today. That's the idea of the method, a perfectly sound idea.
There are no objections to the idea itself. Libby, the author of the method, wasn't a historian, and did not question the veracity of the Scaligerian datings, which had been used for the justification and calibration of his method according to his book.
However, the archaeologist Vladimir Milojcic has proved this method to give random errors of 1,000 to 2,000 years, while its independent dating of the ancient specimens faithfully follows the datings offered by the consensual chronology.
Naturally, there can be no talk of proof here. Let us quote some rather meaningful details. As we have already noted,
Libby had a priori been certain of the veracity of Scaligerian datings.
He wrote, "Throughout Roman and Egyptian history, we have no disagreements.
We haven't had very many measurements to make, because in general, the archaeologists know the dates better than we can measure them, and it is usually as a favor that they give us samples,
which are actually destroyed, being burned in the radiocarbon measurement process. Not physicists to archaeologists, but the other way around, archaeologists did favor to physicists. In what concerns the several reference measurements that were conducted on ancient artifacts, the situation is as follows.
The radiocarbon dating of the Egyptian collection of Breasted, this is a famous Egyptologist, gave unexpected result.
Libby writes, and our third object from Egypt turned out to be modern.
It was one of the famous U.S. Egyptologists' prize collections, supposed to be from the 5th dynasty, as I remember.
This was a dark day. My comment,
the 5th dynasty is generally dated from 2563 to 2423 BC or approximately 4 millennia BC.
And here's what the modern commentator Klein writes on this topic.
The evidence that they, the proponents of the radiocarbon method, use for proving the veracity of their method, is rather insubstantial, with all the indications being indirect, the calculations imprecise, and the interpretation ambiguous. The main argument is the radiocarbon datings of the specimens whose age is known for certain, used for reference. Every time referential measurements are mentioned, everybody quotes the results of the first referential datings that were obtained for a very limited number of specimens.
And here's what archaeologist Milojcic revealed. It was a well-known scandal.
The classical archaeologist pondered the set of dates that physicists began to obtain when various samples were brought to them. Being a free-thinking and critically minded individual, he noticed huge fluctuations.
He began investigating the method and delved into its fundamentals.
As Libby says, for each epoch, one must take a certain average value of radiocarbon in a living organism, and it decays exponentially.
And Milojcic conducted a series of experiments that caused a tremendous stir among physicists, archaeologists, and historians.
The shell of a living American mollusk has the radioactivity index of 13.8 as compared to the average value of 15.3. Which makes it a respectable 1200 years old.
A live North African wild rose flower with a radioactivity of 14.7 has been dead for 360 years, according to the physicists.
As for the Australian eucalyptus with a radioactivity of 16.31, it isn't likely to exist anywhere in the next 600 years.
A shell from Florida with a value of 17.4 decays per minute shall only appear in 1080 years. Nature magazine reports the results of analyzing the C14 content of organic material contained in the mortar of an English castle which is known to have been built 738 years ago.
The radiocarbon dating gave the age of 7,370 years as a result.
The radiocarbon dating deviation amounts to 6 millennia and a half. One wonders whether there was any point in quoting decades with such precision.
The radiocarbon analysis of seals that have just been shot defined their age as 1,300 years, i.e. dating mistake of 1,300 years. Seals mummified 30 years ago have been dated as 4,600 years old, with a dating error of 4,500 years.
This is not Milojcic. This is Nature magazine. Quote from the Antarctic Journal of the United States. Summary. I'll skip the details, we're keeping it brief. Let us sum up the information.
The real activity of ancient specimens may alter from the average value for the following reasons. First, a temporal change in timber activity, plus or minus 2% deviation range. Second, cosmic ray intensity changes, theoretical estimation, plus or minus 20%. Short-term changes of solar activity, additional 2%. An increase in the mixing rate of the oceanic water, minus 2%. Variations in radiocarbon concentration depending on the geographical location and the tree species, plus or minus 8.5%. Sixth, variations in radiocarbon content resulting from decomposition processes, unknown. Seventh, variations in radiocarbon content resulting from a specimen's chemical processing, unknown.
Eighth, the variations in the exchange reservoir radiocarbon content resulting from the washing out of carbonate rock formations, unknown.
This isn't from us.
It's an official table from the standard textbook adopted in laboratories today. 9.
Variations in radiocarbon content caused by large quantities of carbonates produced by volcanic eruptions, unknown. This reason can provide for significant distortion of radiocarbon datings for the areas close to volcanoes, such as Italy.
Italy is considered an ancient country with volcanoes like Vesuvius and Etna.
Etna is still active, and Vesuvius also erupts from time to time.
Moreover, some effects may really be difficult to evaluate currently.
However, a number of effects reflected in literature may be quantitatively assessed after a series of experiments. No careful activity reports of either living or dead specimens have been made for any of the below. First, latitude. Second, longitude. Third, proximity to certain geological and geographical formation on dry land and in the ocean. Fourth, altitude above the sea level. Fifth, climate.
Without such analysis,
the self-righteous claims of the alleged independence of specimen activity from their locations and other characteristics are altogether impossible to understand. Therefore, we have to concede the following. I reiterate that the idea of the radiocarbon method is good, but unfortunately, it is not yet perfected today.
It is evident that there are many problems in finalizing its calibration and understanding whether samples close to us in time can be dated.
Thus, the radiocarbon method in its current condition has deviation rate of 1,000 to 2,000 years for specimens whose age is estimated as under 1,000 years. Therefore, it is not yet suitable for dating historical samples with an age of 2,000 years or less. This means, there's not much to be learnt about the events of the last 2 millennia from this method. That is, antiquity and the Middle Ages. The radiocarbon method needs a fresh graduation that would not be based on Chronology chronology at the very least.
Other physical dating methods are even less precise. Ergo, they can tell us nothing about the dating of objects younger than 2,000 years.
The actual archaeological methods that aren't based on documented chronology can give no absolute dates. These methods can only aid the estimation of relative chronology of some findings in a limited number of cases.
Chronology chronology implicitly or explicitly affected the graduations of scales used for archaeological and even physical methods, including the radiocarbon method. This also questions the usability of the method in its current condition for the dating of historical objects. And the last important point. According to a number of archaeologists, not all of them, the deeply flawed practice of familiarizing the physical laboratories that perform radiocarbon datings with the opinions of the archaeologists about the estimated ages of findings still exists.
We're not ready to move away from the radiocarbon method just yet.
Let's discuss the famous case, the dating of the Shroud of Turin.
The reports of the radiocarbon dating of one of the most famous Christian holy objects, the Shroud of Turin, caused a great resonance in 1988.
Now, there will be photos. According to the traditional version, this piece of cloth bears the image of the body of crucified Christ and dates from the 1st century AD, which is supposed to make it about 2,000 years old.
However, radiocarbon datings have given a different dating, roughly 11th–13th century AD.
Comments.
The sample is famous, and its dating attracted a lot of attention.
Therefore, unlike previous measurements, samples were sent to 3 independent laboratories for comparison. And it turned out that the interval was the 11th–13th century. The radiocarbon analysis has been conducted in 3 laboratories, in Oxford University, Arizona University, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. In our book, King of the Slavs, we extensively discussed the radiocarbon dating of the shroud. It turns out that the most probable date is the second half of the 12th century. The dating of the shroud to the 11th–13th centuries has proved shocking for many. Quote,
in September 1988 a report appeared, telling of the analysis and the fact that it gave a certain dating of the shroud's fabric which turned out 1,000 years more recent than the alleged date of Christ's death, even if the shroud is dated as an 11th century artifact. The author ceases the discussion of the dating after this, and begins to ponder the veracity of Christ's image as seen on the shroud. What's the matter?
Naturally, one arrives to the following conclusions.
Either the Shroud of Turin is a forgery. The radiocarbon datings can contain errors of several centuries or even millennia. Or the Shroud of Turin is original, but dated to the 11th–13th century AD, and not to the 1st century AD. If this be the case, it is natural to ask about the century that Christ's lifetime pertains to.
Could it really have been the 12?
Here are different versions.
This is a photograph of the Shroud of Turin.
It shows the imprint of the body of Christ.
He is lying on his back with his hands folded. Here is the head, chest, and legs.
These are traces of a fire.
The cloth was folded and stored.
During the Middle Ages, there was a fire, and the fabric was burnt here.
So, this is a later damage to the fabric. An enlarged image of the face from the shroud. Some minor computer processing has been done. 2 images of the shroud, positive and negative. It is long. It is folded.
This is one half.
The imprint of Christ's body.
And this is the second half.
It was laid on top.
As we are told today, it is believed that the body was wrapped between 2 pieces of fabric.
This was the upper cloth. Here is the face. And this was the lower cloth.
The back was imprinted there. At this point, we will conclude our discussion on radiocarbon dating and move on to the next method, which has been used since the times of Petavius and Kepler.
It was actively used by Isaac Newton, astronomical dating. The idea is simple. In ancient texts, eclipses are described.
This doesn't happen often, but it happens. The eclipse is bound to the events described in this chronicle. If you describe the eclipse in sufficient detail, today you can reconstruct the date based on its parameters.
Today there are tables, and even computer algorithms that allow you to calculate back the celestial sky based on the data of this eclipse, understand when the eclipse occurred, and obtain the date of the event described in the chronicle.
This is quite a reasonable idea.
And since the time of Newton and Kepler, it has been actively used. And now, let's veer off course a bit.
There's a mysterious leap in a certain parameter d double dash in the theory of lunar motion. Let me explain.
I'll provide information from celestial mechanics, astronomy. It's called the elongation of the moon.
What is it?
Imagine the sun, the Earth's orbit. The Earth revolves around the sun. The moon revolves around the Earth. The Earth moves, the moon moves. The angle between the vectors directed from the Earth to the moon, and from the Earth to the sun.
This angle is called elongation. It's a function of time, the angle changes. The same goes for Venus.
Venus, Earth, Sun.
Instead of the moon, it's Venus, elongation of the Venus. What is it?
The vector is directed from the Earth to Venus, from the Earth to the Sun.
That's the angle.
The Earth orbits, Venus moves.
At another moment in time, the angle will change. The angle at the marked point differs from this angle. It's a function of time. D double dash is the second derivative of the elongation. Here's a graph depicting the behavior of this parameter known from celestial mechanics, describing the dynamics of a pair of celestial bodies, Earth-Moon. The graph was calculated by the renowned astronomer Robert Newton. What did he do? He took the time axis.
He took a list of eclipses described in ancient and medieval chronicles.
He took their dates.
Naturally, he took their dating from tables by modern historians on chronology. He's an astronomer, not a historian.
He took these Scaligerian dates and calculated the parameter d double dash, describing a certain dynamic.
Roughly speaking, it's the acceleration of the moon. He got the graph. The graph amazed him.
Here it is drawn. It's not Isaac Newton, it's Robert.
Newton himself wrote about it the following. The most striking feature is the rapid decline in d double dash from about 700 AD to about 1300 AD.
This decline means that there was a square wave in the oscillating value of d double dash. Such changes in d double dash, and such values, are incapable of explanation by present geophysical theories. Robert Newton wrote an entire monograph titled Astronomical Evidence Concerning Non-Gravitational Forces in the Earth-Moon System that was concerned with trying to prove this mysterious gap in the behavior of d double dash, which manifested as a leap by an entire numeric order. One has to note that these mysterious non-gravitational forces failed to manifest in any other way at all.
In celestial mechanics, a certain problem arose. I dealt with this issue at one time.
At that time, I was involved in celestial mechanics.
It was a famous subject.
A conference was specially convened in England to discuss this remarkable leap, a rupture in the behavior of the acceleration of the moon. Existing theories of gravity and existing models do not explain such a leap.
It's no wonder Robert Newton started talking about some strange non-gravitational forces. And now, let's temporarily set aside this subject and turn to the dating of eclipses. I remind you that it was on the dates of eclipses that Robert Newton based his calculations.
The discovery of an interesting effect, an unprejudiced astronomical dating shifts the dates of the ancient eclipses to the Middle Ages. The following method of independent astronomical dating was proposed by Morozov. Obtaining all of the characteristics described in the chronicle, such as the phase, the time, geographical observation location, etc., and copying all of the eclipse dates fitting these characteristics from the reference tables mechanically.
Morozov discovered that the astronomers had been under the pressure of Scaligerian chronology, and so only considered the dates that Scaligerian chronology had already ascribed to the eclipse in question and the events related thereto.
которые попадают в интервал времени, уже заранее предназначенные скалерской хронологией для исследуемого затмения и связанных с ним событий.
As a result, in many cases astronomers failed to find eclipses corresponding to the chronicle description in the required century, and had to resort to approximations, without the merest thought of questioning Scaligerian chronology and indicating eclipses that would fit the chronicle description partially. Having revised the datings of the eclipses considered ancient, Morozov found that the reports of these events fall into two categories.
The first category, brief and nebulous accounts.
The astronomical dating has no meaning whatsoever.
2. Exhaustive, detailed reports.
The astronomical solution for those is often singular, or there are 2 or 3 solutions at most. Apparently, all of the eclipses with detailed descriptions falling into the period between 1000 BC and 500 AD get independent astronomical datings that differ significantly from the ones offered by Scaligerian chronology and belong to a much later epoch, namely, the interval between 500 and 1700 AD. Being of the opinion that Scaligerian chronology was correct about the interval from 500 to 1800 AD for the most part, Morozov did not analyze the mediaeval eclipses of the interval from 500 to 1700 AD, assuming that no contradictions would be found there.
He unnecessarily failed to do so, as if he lacked the resolve to continue the calculations further. Thus, continuing the research started by Morozov, the author of this book, speaking of myself, conducted an analysis of other mediaeval eclipses in the interval between 400 and 1600 AD.
It turned out that the transfer effect affecting the ancient eclipses as described by Morozov also applies to those usually dated to 400 to 900 AD.
This either means that there are many possible astronomical solutions, which make the dating uncertain, or there are just 1 or 2, in which case they all fall in the interval between 900 and 1700 AD. Only starting with approximately 1000 AD, and not 400 AD, according to Morozov, does the Scaligerian dating, as given in the astronomical canon, namely Ginzel's canon, begin to concur with the results of Morozov's method satisfactorily enough, becoming more or less certain by as late a date as 1300 AD.
Let us give a few extremely representative examples demonstrating how the ancient eclipses and the chronicles that describe them become a great deal younger.
For brevity, let's take one example.
The famous historian of antiquity, Thucydides, described the history of Greece in his renowned work,
Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which historians supposedly date to the 5th century BC.
Thucydides described 3 eclipses. Here is one description from Thucydides. This is the original text. This is the first eclipse. Then he described the second eclipse. Here is a quote from his book. The third eclipse. It's called the Thucydides eclipse triad. The thing is, Thucydides described many details about this triad.
The interval in years between them is indicated, the phase is indicated, the solar eclipse was total, and so on. In total, for this triad, Thucydides provided 12 parameters. A very detailed description, 12 very detailed pieces of information.
This is a very vivid narrative. And what happened? As mentioned, astronomers sought a solution around the 5th century BC.
They proposed such dates as -430, 423, 412 BC. Unfortunately, as mentioned earlier, they had to stretch interpretations. For example, an eclipse described as a total solar eclipse was presented here as partial.
This solution does not satisfy all 12 data points and therefore is a long stretch.
What followed after that?
After that, Morozov, and then we, conducted a full analysis of all eclipses up to the year 1800, aiming to find eclipses with the described characteristics. 12 characteristics, that's a lot.
Firstly, a solution was found. Secondly, it is unique. And thirdly, it is a solution of the 12th century AD, 1133, 1140, 1151.
The eclipses are perfectly visible. All 12 conditions are fulfilled. The eclipses are described as total solar eclipses.
Here is the only solution that satisfies all of Thucydides' parameters throughout the time interval, from our time down to ancient times.
Well, after that, let's return to parameter d', with which we began the story about astronomy.
I remind you, here is the graph obtained by Newton.
Gap, leap, mystery, some mystique, a special conference in London. Astronomers discuss this leap and can't find the solution.
Newton writes a paper stating that supposedly, non-gravitational forces are responsible for this.
They double-checked his calculations.
I double-checked based on his data. It was said that everything was fine. Newton's calculations were correct.
They checked everything, except one thing. No one questioned the dates of the eclipses on which the graph is based.
The calculation is based on data taken from the tables. These points are distributed along the timeline.
What did I do?
I simply took Morozov's tables, in which old eclipses got new dates,
A shift in dates into the Middle Ages, after the 10th century, and recalculated the d'' graph, substituting these parameters into the same algorithm. Here is the answer that I obtained and was published in the scientific press. The picture is very vivid.
It turned out that the modern segment is reliable. This is the modern acceleration of the Moon.
It hardly changes from our time to 1,000 years ago, to approximately the 10th century of the Common Era. Here chaos begins because in the ancient descriptions, the further they are, the less detailed they become. The datings begin to bounce. This is a zone of unstable data, while these are reliable dates.
And here, there is no data.
We do not know what was happening here. Such data did not reach us. Here is the genuine graph. No leaps, no mysteries, no need to search for mysterious forces. Such an unexpected solution to a well-known problem of celestial mechanics arose, based on a bright unexpected fact that with unbiased dating, instead of ancient dates, the ancient eclipses turn out to be more modern, significantly closer to us.
This is a story from astronomy. Let's move on. Astronomy is not limited to dating eclipses. In old documents and images, on the walls of temples, there are images of what is known as zodiacs. The zodiac is the zodiacal constellations, of which there are 12, Pisces, Leo, and so on. Ancient astronomers depicted planets on them, thereby recording the date.
It should be understood that the zodiac, sometimes called a horoscope today, is celestial clockwork.
The zodiacal circle is a clock face. Planets move along it. Their speed of movement is more or less uniform, and it is known. In ancient times, it was believed that there were 5 planets. 2 more planets, the Sun and the Moon, were added to them. They were also considered planets. It turned out to be 7 planets, 7 hands on the clock face. They move independently of each other.
An astronomer, sculptor, or artist draws the position of the planets in the zodiac, and this gives a date. There may be one, there may be several, but this is a very vivid and reliable way to date ancient descriptions and images. Naturally, starting from the time of Kepler and Newton, astronomers tried to date found zodiacs using this method. Example: Egypt. The images known as the round and the rectangular zodiac nowadays have been found in the Dendera temple in Egypt. Multiple attempts of the 19th–20th century astronomers to find ancient solutions that would fit the horoscopes depicted on the zodiacs have failed to yield any results. Such eminent scientists as Laplace, Fourier, Lettron, Biot and Helm have tried to solve this problem. The search for a correct solution was eventually abandoned after many unsuccessful attempts. Nowadays the temple and the horoscopes are dated to 30 BC and the second zodiac to 14 to 37 AD.
However, this dating does not withstand criticism. Nevertheless, it turns out that there are exact astronomical solutions. Our book on this topic, The Celestial Calendar of the Ancients, discussed this. Let's take a look.
Here is an image of the Dendera temple in the famous description of Egypt created by artists who accompanied Napoleon's military campaign to conquer Egypt.
He took artists, historians, and archaeologists with him to sketch Egypt.
Here is the Dendera temple in the background.
This is a partially ruined arch.
The temple up close.
The image was made by Napoleon's artists.
This is a side view. The temple is in ruins.
Firstly, Napoleon's troops didn't hesitate to fire cannonballs and shells at Mamluks but at the monuments of Egypt as well. For example, the well-known damage to the face of the Sphinx.
Its nose was knocked off.
Nowadays, tourists like to take photos under this Sphinx.
Its nose was knocked off by the cannons of Napoleon's gunners, who practiced hitting the Sphinx's nose accurately. Some succeeded, some did not, but unfortunately, the Sphinx's nose was destroyed. But Napoleon is not the only one to blame.
In the 17th century, Egypt also suffered from a wave of Ottoman devastation.
So, the ruins are caused not only by Napoleon's campaign but also by the Ottomans, who were in Egypt about 200 years earlier. This is another image of the temple in Dendera. This is a modern photograph.
Tourists who come to Egypt today can visit it.
However, this place is not very popular.
Few people know that there are remarkable zodiacs here. Another photo of this temple in Dendera. A view from above.
The temple was built, in general, like a monastery. This is a typical monastic structure, like those in Russia.
A wall surrounds it, inside is the temple and living quarters for monks.
But the temple is certainly ancient.
The temple dates back many centuries before the Common Era.
This is ancient Egypt.
It's not even medieval Egypt. It's not Egypt of the Ptolemaic era of the Roman Empire.
This is long before ancient Rome.
Here is the famous round zodiac depicted on the ceiling of the temple.
This is a modern drawing from the description of Egypt, made by Napoleon's artists.
Here are depicted constellations. I will show them later.
For example, Leo, Taurus, Libra, and so on, and planets as wayfarers. This is clockworks with 7 hands, frozen up on the face at some ancient date.
Naturally, astronomers wanted to date these events. Then the zodiac was barbarically torn out. Later the French transported it to the Louvre. Nowadays it is in the Louvre. Those interested can visit it. It is heavily damaged, darkened, and chipped.
What remains, remains.
Thank God that Napoleon's artists carefully sketched the zodiac. These are enlarged photographs of the round zodiac in the Louvre. For example, here is an image of Saturn, a wayfarer with a sickle, a symbol of death.
This situation is dated. As I mentioned, it's a remarkable occasion that we managed to find a preserved clock face with 7 hands on it. As I've already mentioned, traditional datings didn't align with the historical epoch required by historians.
Therefore,
astronomers gave up and abandoned dating.
However, we were not bound by these assumptions.
After reviewing all datings from ancient times to our time, until 1900, we dated the zodiac. A solution was found, and it's unique, just like in the case of Thucydides.
It's understandable.
The ancient astronomers directed the artists and sculptors, which is why the zodiac was made so meticulously, and so much effort was put into it.
They wanted to fix the date, and they succeeded. The solution is unambiguous. The dating of this zodiac is the morning of March 20th, 1185 AD. I repeat, the historical Scaligerian dating is many centuries before the Common Era. There are many zodiacs in Egypt. I will only list 10 of them, and later I will show a summary table. The rectangular zodiac, also in Dendera. It's in the neighboring temple, in the hypostyle temple. This is the main zodiac in a huge hall with columns. Like in the main building of Moscow State University, on the second floor, only larger. When you go up, there are columns, a ceiling. It's like a model of an ancient Egyptian hypostyle hall. This zodiac is located on the ceiling of this hall in Dendera. It's a huge hall. April 1168 AD. There is only small distance in time between them. It's the same era of the Dendera temple. The zodiac from the Greater Temple of Esna dates back to the 14th century AD, and from the Lesser Temple of Esna to the beginning of the 15th century AD. A bit later I will show the horoscopes of Athribis of Flinders Petrie.
The upper and lower zodiacs date back to the 13th century AD.
The color horoscope of Thebes in Luxor.